Hi, my name is Michelle McLeod. Welcome to our part 2 of Preventive Controls for Human Foods. In this course, we are going to review what you already learned in part 1, and we are going to go through exercises so that you get a chance to work through your own food safety plan and evaluate your thoughts and processes around the regulations that you have learned so far. Now, you do have to have taken part 1 in order to take part 2 and to get your PCQI certificate. So once you complete those exercises and once you've watched each of the videos for these chapter reviews, you should be all set after you send in that form. Let's get started. This course is standardized curriculum. It's created by the FSPCA. Completing this course, along with part 1, is a way to become a PCQI. You can also qualify through experience. You just have to submit that you understand the regulation, show your CV, the years of experience that you have within the food industry, and that way you can become a PCQI without taking said course. But you're here today, so you're going to become a PCQI this way. The form I mentioned earlier that you need to fill out, it's an Excel spreadsheet. It requires you to put your name, your company, your email. That is so that they can get your certificate to you. The FSPCA will be emailing your certificate once you complete it. The course, make sure you spell everything correctly. If you misspell your name's going to be misspelled on your certificate. If you misspell your email, then you're not going to receive your certificate. And with that, let's get rolling. This is our agenda for today. As you can see, there's a lot of review. We're going to look at the introduction to the course, what a food safety plan is, how you go about building it, the other prerequisite programs and things that help build your food safety system, like good manufacturing practices. We get to look over each individual type of hazard, so biological, chemical, and physical hazards. And then we look at how you would go about finding resources to build a food safety plan, the steps when you're beginning to build one, and then how you actually do a hazard analysis and determine your sanitation process, allergen, and supply chain preventive controls. The next part is to look at how we manage those systems, so monitoring and verification and validation, record keeping, and then recall plans. So what do we do if something goes wrong? And then at the very end, there's a regulation review. We have a special video for that for you and a crossword puzzle. So you can see with most of these chapter reviews, we have exercises associated with them, and we will be helping you through those. There are a lot of course materials that go along with this particular class. We have our participant manual, which has all the slides that you would see within that 3-day course. We have several food safety plan examples. We have our exercise workbook, and we have those broken down so that you can do one exercise at a time in the Google Classroom if you are accessing that. Just a quick disclosure from the FSPCA. We as instructors, we are not representative of the FSPCA. We don't work for the FSPCA. We get certified in preventive controls, and then we do a preventive controls train the trainer. So we don't give out legal advice. The FSPCA doesn't guarantee accuracy of information, and they don't necessarily guarantee that this curriculum would ensure your compliance with FDA's regulations. And they don't give any warranties. So this is just the FSPCA doing a little self-protection here. So what are we addressing in this section? Would you rather meet Bigfoot or an alien? Me personally, I'd rather meet an alien because I have a lot of questions about technology and the universe. Very curious. I've had people say they want to meet Bigfoot because they want to learn new life skills and how to survive in the woods. It's not what this course is about. That's one of my openers. Without doing this in person, it just feels strange not to do that. So I want you to think about it. What would you rather meet? In this particular module, we get to look at how the course is actually set out and what our goals are, how preventive controls establish food safety principles. So it's really about when we have a food system in place, what were the pieces that we had to start with? What was the new regulation like, and what did they build upon? How is it related to HACCP? And what your responsibilities might be as a preventive controlled qualified individual. The other part is where to find definitions for this course. So at the very end of the chapter, we have several definitions. That is because regulations are written in government speak. It can be really challenging to understand them thoroughly. It's almost like they're written intentionally to be confusing sometimes. So we'll look at different definitions for different terms, and that way we can all stay above board and understand what we're looking at. The way this course is set up is that first you get background information on food safety, look at where to find guidance from the FDA and the USDA. Then once we look at where we can find our resources, we actually move into that food safety plan development. And so this is where the majority of our exercises lie. So there's quite a lot that goes into it. You get an example food to work with, so you get to choose from an array of different example food safety plans, different food products. It's most useful to choose one that's like your product. That said, you can choose whatever you like. And then once you go through working on how you build a food safety plan, you're not going to build an entire food safety plan. That's just not practical to do by yourself, and certainly not within the allotted time for the class. But you'll get to learn the steps of how to do it and have the tools to be able to do it yourself once you're back at work applying this. And then at the end, after we work through those exercises and those food safety plans, we get to do a review of the actual regulations so you can look at how it's written. One of the big things to remember when you're looking at the regulations, you're looking at this course. The FDA is very specific about language. So when they say must, that means you have to do that. They started using must instead of shall because they believed it's more clear. If something is a guidance, it is considered to be a best practice. And what that means is it's a really good idea to do it. And if you aren't doing what the government says you should do, you should have a good reason why and back up for that reason. You get to choose what's best for your product in terms of safety. You know your facility, you know your product. So you get to be the decision maker in terms of what means safe food and safe product for yourself. So if you can justify the decisions that you make for your own facility, then you can justify not following a specific guidance, then you're good to go. But remember, anything that says must, that means you absolutely have to follow it. Our government recognizes that we're all built differently. Our food safety systems are going to be different for our different facilities and for our different products. They also recognize that we only have a certain amount of resources. And it's really important to allocate those resources in a way that makes the most sense. So when we talk about risk-based preventive controls, we're really talking about what matters the most in terms of food safety. So what can actually make somebody sick? What can make them throw up and get the squirts? Or what can actually, cut somebody's mouth or choke them, or they could swallow and cut up their insides. That's what we're focusing on. Sometimes when people get into a hazard analysis and building a food safety plan, they tend to overthink, and they might find themselves trying to make preventive controls for everything, including things that would normally be covered under good manufacturing practices. Like, I am definitely worried about somebody's hands and whether or not they're actually dirty or clean, but I do have good manufacturing practices in place for people to wash their hands. Because I have that in place, I don't need a preventive control for that. I know that's going to work on a regular basis. I'm doing employee training. I'm taking care of that. I can generally overview that people are washing their hands on a regular basis without having to document every single time it happens, right? Because if somebody doesn't wash their hands, it's not necessarily a critical failure. It's not necessarily going to be unsafe food. Now, on the other side of that, I've had people start overthinking in the way that they plan for everything that they think could happen. Like maybe they're thinking of some crazy microbe that has like a 1 in a million chance of infecting their product. Again, not really too likely. So we're not going to make a preventive control for that. So the idea is to make it practical so that it's possible to work through on a regular basis. Because when you do have a deviation from a preventive control, from that critical measure that you've implemented, that indicates that you might have unsafe food. That means you have to do a corrective action. You're going to have a whole lot of paperwork surrounding that. There's a monitoring around these points. There may be validation around it. You're definitely going to be doing a lot of verification around it. So that takes a lot of manpower, time. And so we want to make sure that we are capable of following the plan that we create. The idea behind it being preventive instead of reactive, well, we've seen the news when people are going through recalls. It can be a massive challenge. There was a company in the news a couple years ago that made frozen foods. And they were doing a recall for a products that had been made 3 years prior. And it was millions of pounds of food that they were recalling. That is not an ideal situation, right? It costs a lot of money. And your reputation really takes a hit for that. So the best idea is to prevent things from happening by making sure we have these systems in place as we're going through finding our suppliers, setting up ourselves and our processes, making sure that we have solid allergen controls in place and good labeling practices, which can also be very challenging, so that everywhere along the way, through our sanitation, everything's clean and good to go. We're preventing any critical outbreaks from happening. The other thing about these preventive controls is that they're built to work with your other systems. So you might have lots of other programs in place. You might have a glass prevention program as a prerequisite program where you're covering your light bulbs with a protective cover so that if a forklift accidentally hits it, then the glass won't shatter into your product. Or you might have a control in place or a program in place. Or you might have something like the window slanted a specific way so that if something hits the window, it breaks outside of the facility and not into your production area. These are things that work with your food safety plan. So you have a food safety system as a whole, and that includes your foundational things like good manufacturing practices and prerequisite programs. And then with that, you have your food safety plan. And that is how you're going to take care of those significant hazards. So those are the ones that are reasonably likely to occur and can cause significant illness or injury. And the idea is to minimize the risk of food safety hazards in general. So we don't want to harm anyone. Our goal is to protect the grandmas and the babies. That's what we're doing here. When we look at regulations, it's important to look at the history of those regulations. And I know you learned about HACCP in part 1 of this class. So I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about how HACCP came about and how preventive controls is built from it and how it's different from it. So HACCP, Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Points, was created by NASA in Pillsbury and the U.S. Army. And really, when you think about an organization, say like NASA, I think they're really on top of things, right? Really are regimented. Everything's listed. Everything's orderly. We have to pay careful attention to potential risks and things that might go wrong and how we might most practically make our everyday experience functional so that we're not having those problems occur all the time. So I want you to imagine that you're an astronaut and you know the scientists who are working at NASA and this specific set, well, they're working on the food, right? And back in the day, they were they were making tubes of paste and cubes of food for the astronauts to eat. Yum, sounds awesome. And so I want you to imagine you're strapped into that rocket. You blast up into space. Now you're floating in 0G. It's pretty freaking cool. And you get hungry. And you're like, okay, I'm going to brave the tube of paste. So you squeeze it into your mouth. Tastes kind of like chicken. Kind of gross. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine. It's not fine. So all of a sudden, your stomach starts getting kind of bumbly. You know that feeling? And then all of a sudden, you chuck your guts into the spaceship. And what happens? It just floats wherever it's going to go. Into the control panels, into your astronaut friend's face. Yeah. Now imagine you're in your spacesuit on a spacewalk. And it's about to come out the other end. You're trying really hard to squeeze your cheeks together. But you just can't quite keep it in. Yeah. So one of the things that happens to the human body when you do things like vomit profusely or get the squirts in your spacesuit is your body becomes dehydrated. And it is really hard to get water in space. So much so that on the International Space Station, they have to recycle and clean their urine to get the water, that they drink. So the scientists at NASA, they're like, you know what? We don't want people to get dehydrated and die in space. We definitely don't want them to be vomiting and having other issues. Put a lot of effort into this. So what they decided to do is they decided to create a system where during the processing, they would put controls in place to make sure that there would be nothing potentially in the food that could make somebody sick or cause them some harm. And that's how HACCP was born. Hazard analysis, what hazards could there be? Critical control point, where can we control it? So a basic example, chicken. Most people know that salmonella is a potential pathogenic bacteria that could infect your chicken. And if you don't cook it properly, you could get sick. So the hazard analysis part, salmonella is associated with chicken. And our critical control point is the cook step. So we know we're going to heat it up to a certain temperature for a certain amount of time. Pretty straightforward. And NASA created all kinds of new ways to process our foods. It's really cool if you ever want to look it up. Some fun food science nerd things in there. HACCP was made mandatory for juice and for the meat industry and the seafood industry. So each time we get a regulation, it's usually because somebody messed up somewhere pretty bad. For example, for the meat industry, they actually ended up getting that particular regulation required because of the outbreak that happened with Jack in the Box. So Jack in the Box had this ground beef that was contaminated with pathogenic E. coli, and that pathogenic E. coli was not cooked. So it didn't die in that burger patty. So undercooked burger patties, E. coli from their supplier. And they ended up killing a bunch of children, which is very tragic and is often a way that we end up getting regulations. So when they decided to bring preventive controls for human foods in, that was actually a part of a larger regulation called the Food Safety Modernization Act, passed into law by Obama in 2011. And companies were given time to adjust before they started following these regulations. So you really didn't start seeing rollouts until about 2017 through 2019 when steadily, it started with the larger companies having to follow, and then the smaller and smaller ones. Now you might be wondering why, right? Like I mentioned before, something bad happens, we get regulations. And so you'll notice when we talk about preventive controls, we're not just talking about critical control points. We're talking about allergen controls, sanitation controls, and supply chain controls. So it's story time. I'm going to tell you about the Peanut Corporation of America. Now, they were a wholesaler company. They made peanut butter and sold it to companies like Nabisco all around the United States. They had some pretty serious inherent issues, one of which being their facility just wasn't well maintained. It wasn't clean. They found rat droppings on top of the bags of peanuts when they finally came to inspect it. The walls and floors were dirty, cracked, and they had, in particular, a leaky roof. Now, when you think about a roof, things that fly overhead, birds flying over the roof. What do birds do? Well, they poop. And we know that most birds tend to have salmonella in their digestive tract. So when they poop, there's salmonella going in on that ceiling. And when it rains, well, now we have salmonella dripping into our peanut butter batch mixer. The other terrible part about this story is that the corporation, the people within it, they were actually committing fraud on a consistent basis. So they were doing the testing for salmonella. They would get positive results, and they would keep testing the peanut butter until they got a negative result, and that's what they would release to their customer as their COA. They also sent out batches without testing it and would get test back results later that was tested positive for salmonella, but they wouldn't say anything. They even had a customer contact them saying, hey, we tested your product. We found salmonella in it. And they're like, no, you're wrong. There's no salmonella in our peanut butter. So it's a just ship it mentality. As you can imagine, eventually a really big problem happened. They had a salmonella outbreak. 714 people got sick and 9 people died. And so because of that, one of our preventive controls that we have is supply chain controls. So I want you to think about Nabisco. They're making those Nutter Butters, right? Peanut butter cookies. If they had been actively testing Peanut Butter Corporation of America's peanut butter to see if in fact their analysis was true and real, or if they had sent somebody over there to audit and inspect them, they would have recognized there was a problem. They could have prevented the recall. They could have prevented the outbreak. It could have saved lives. The other side of that is sanitation. It's just like in your kitchen. If your kitchen isn't clean, you're not going to be making good food, right? So for your manufacturing facility, if it's not clean, you're going to be in trouble. Just like Bluebell. So this is also another reason we have this regulation. Bluebell had a pathogenic bacteria called Listeria in their refrigerator area where they were storing their ice cream. Listeria monocytogenes is particularly harmful in that 1 in 3 people that develop listeriosis actually die. And it can survive and grow at freezing temperatures. It will grow at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. And it causes stillbirth in women. So Bluebell didn't know they had this in their refrigerator. And it got onto the outside of the packaging. And you know those little cups that you got when you were a kid with the chocolate and the vanilla and the swirl? It was on those. These weren't going to kids. It was going to an elderly care center. I want you to think about that. Anytime we have an at-risk population, you're way more likely to see significant harm. And in this case, they accidentally killed 3 people. They fired half their staff. It was 500 people. They basically had to stop production. They hired back some people at partial pay to reclean the facility. They lost a lot of business. When they finally got back up and running, it was only a couple years later where they actually ended up having a listeria issue again, this time coming from their cookie dough supplier. So it came in with those cookie dough balls that go into the ice cream. So again, sanitation controls, supply chain controls. If we up the game on those, we can prevent all kinds of issues. Then you see allergens up there. 30 to 50% of recalls are caused by allergens. Generally speaking, it's usually not being on the label, and it's so easy to accidentally mislabel something. You pick up a wrong label, you pick up an old label. Maybe you change your run order for the day and not everyone gets the message. It happens, human error. And so that's why we have to put those tighter controls in place. In addition to that, not everyone is aware of how sensitive allergies can be and how small they are, because the thing that causes somebody an allergic reaction is so small you can't see it. So for example, pollen, which in terms of size is one of the largest allergens, pollen can fit on the foot of a dust mite, which is about the width of a human hair. And most allergens are much, much, much smaller than pollen. So it takes a lot to ensure that surfaces are free and clear of allergens, that you're taking care of those airways, that people are paying attention to those GMPs around washing hands and gowning, that we have things segregated and labeled and color-coded, and all of those controls and parameters that we put in place. So we still have critical control points under preventive controls, except we call them process preventive controls under this newer regulation. So that's where we took HACCP and made preventive controls bigger than HACCP. Right? So just doing a bit more. They changed some of the language because they like to do that. And instead of critical limits, which generally bring to mind numbers, they have parameters and values. That is to help you think of things like, this is visually clean as a potential parameter or value, or a label check. Is the allergen on the label? Yes, that's your parameter. Monitoring is the same. Corrective actions are the same. They've added corrections, and that's because of that sanitation preventive control. So anytime I do a corrective action, it's because I exceeded my parameters and values. I might have unsafe food. And now I have to go through this whole process, corrective action, preventive action, keep it from happening again. If it's a sanitation control and I don't have any potentially unsafe food, then I'm going to do a correction. So I'm going to take, say you come in the morning and you haven't started any production yet, and you look at the equipment and you're like, oh, it didn't quite get cleaned well enough last night. You would pre-clean before you start production. That is a sanitation correction, not a corrective action, because you didn't have unsafe food. In addition to all of this, the hazard analysis, the preventive control, and the implementations that we have around it, we also have to have a recall plan. So we have to actually list out what we're going to do, who we're going to call, what that contact information is, who's allowed to say what before we actually get started. That way we know what we're doing in the event of a recall, because they're very difficult to go through. They are very expensive and they're very stressful. Always good to have a plan, and you do mock recalls. Then those last two, verification and record keeping. Your verification is about checking to make sure that your plan's working the way you intended it to. And record keeping, that is the proof that you are doing all this. So that is the proof that you are maintaining safety in your food system. If you didn't write it down, According to the FDA, it didn't happen. I mentioned earlier that your food safety system includes your food safety plan, your GMPs, and other prerequisite programs. So those current good manufacturing practices and prerequisite programs, those are the foundation. It's like building a house. They're the foundation to having safe food. If I don't have a clean kitchen and I want to make you cookies, would you be excited? What if my oven doesn't work? What if my dog hangs around my kitchen and his hair's going everywhere? What if there are flies? What if I'm not very good about washing my dishes well and I had to wash my hands? What if I spit while I'm mixing that dough, right? Now you don't want cookies. So that's the foundation. We have to have all of that stuff in place in order to make any of this work. So your food safety plan really sits on that. And your food safety plan starts with that hazard analysis and identifying, all right, what's associated with our process, what's associated with our product, and what could potentially go wrong. And then we look at, okay, which of these things can we control with prerequisite programs or good manufacturing practices? All right, we'll do that as much as we can because we want as few preventive controls as possible to make this practical. What hazards absolutely require preventive control, right? Which ones are really likely to happen? Which ones are going to cause significant harm to someone? Okay, we are going to make sure we put controls in place for those, and we'll choose the appropriate control. Now, when you do this process, the hazard analysis, and choosing which hazards are significant enough to require preventive control, you're going to have a lot of debates. If you're doing it with your team, people are going to have different opinions. That is normal. If you do a hazard analysis today and you do another one next week, you are going to come up with different answers. That is normal. So you just have to go through this process, think about it clearly, identify what it makes the most sense to do, what is practical for you and your facility to do, and that's how you decide which controls are preventive controls. You get to see a lot of definitions in this material. So here, you've probably already seen it in part 1, but again, we'll revisit it in part 2, a preventive controls qualified individual definition. This is going to be important later for your exercise. Essentially what they're saying here is that if you've taken this training, or if you have the experience that would be equivalent to this training for your job, then you can become a preventive controls qualified individual, or a PCQI, as we usually say it. So now that we've looked at that, it's time to do our first exercise. Okay. What we're going to do is we're going to look at the definitions for qualified individual and preventive controls qualified individual. I am going to have these definitions listed for you in your exercise document. However, it's important to be able to access your manual. So using on your computer, if you pull it up as a PDF, you're looking at, this is your full manual. So it has the entire slide deck, all the appendices together. You're going to hit Control F to find qualified individual. So you type in qualified individual, and that'll give you the definition. Same thing for preventive controls qualified individual. So you want to look at both of those. It's important to be able to use your manual in case you want to use it in the future for building your own food safety plan at your own facility, but also because it makes this course easier. The next step is to look at Appendix A. So I have the appendices separated for you, but you're also welcome to look at it in the entire course manual, however is the simplest for you. What you're looking for is 21 CFR 117.180, and you're looking at A and C. So that is on page A119. Again, you can hit Control F and look up that 21 CFR 117.180, and it should show up for you. Once you've read all that, right? So we know how to look at a regulation, we know how to use our resources for definitions. It's time to answer some questions. The first one is to write down tasks that you are comfortable performing. So what do you already do at work in regards to food safety or quality or product safety? The second part is to write down what you hope to learn to perform in this class. So really, what do you want to get out of this class? That helps you identify upfront what it is that you need. And that way we can really get to the heart of it. Then the third one is, what will you likely ask other people to help you perform? We all need help in this world. Usually when we do these things, we have a team. Some businesses are small and they don't, but we're going to do the best we can. So we ask for help when we need it. So what would you need help with when you're building a food safety plan or you're trying to implement these things at work? Maybe you're trying to push out your food safety program into your facility, out to your employees, and trying to get everyone on board with your food safety culture. It can be a big challenge. So I want you to answer those questions. And when you're done, we're going to come back to the video and we get to do our next section.